Thanks very much, Sean, and hello everybody, and I'm very happy to be back again this year. As a public speaking engagement, it did stand out during my time in the CBI, and I am very happy to be back. And I suppose while I'm on that topic, it's important for me to make clear, just like John, that anything I say this evening is in fact on my own behalf from now on. So I have 6 slides. I promise not to kill you by PowerPoint, but I do want to put up a few figures. Our recovery, it seems, is gradually taking hold, and fragile as it may be, it has been hard won and should be seen as a major achievement of both the citizens and its elected government. The Troika has left, and we are once again notionally in charge of ourselves. However, with the EU ever watchful and with the requirement that our deficit be brought into line, there continues to be much in the way of internal and external risk that might derail our gradual return to economic health. The external threats are somewhat beyond our control, and it would seem to me reasonably obvious that we should focus on, judge our progress and hold ourselves accountable for how well we do on managing and reducing risks from within, those that are directly controllable by the state, its government and its citizens. Also, in addition, then, if an extraneous shock does occur, we are at least in the best possible shape to deal with it. What do I mean by that? Well, in a small, open economy, the current economic uplift in the UK is very helpful, as is news on unemployment and other stats from the USA, and indeed the stabilisation in the EU. However, it is not difficult to see how a downturn in the US or a sudden UK exit from Europe, or the recent instability of a Portuguese bank, for instance, might have an impact here, and should any such major shock occur, we could largely only control such a circumstance after the event. So for today, I have picked 2 major threats to our recovery that I believe arise from within our own little island, but also, just as importantly, 2 that I believe are within our collective control. So slide 1, I want to start with the figures. And I don't want to get too bogged down, of course, and I've rounded everything to keep it simple, but I believe we should anchor the current economic conversations in a reasonably tough reality. These numbers represent what people mean when they talk about recovery. So after 5 years of property taxes, universal social charge, VAT increases, water charges imminent, Croke Park 1 and 2, Haddington Road, double-digit unemployment rates, medical cutbacks, pupil-teacher ratio changes, SNAs gone from classrooms, in 2013 we spent 11 billion more than we collected in taxes. Having come so far and done so well, and really this chart does represent a significant and considerable success, the risk is really that we have grown tired of it all, or that we haven't focused enough on the numbers, or maybe that we have oversold the success to ourselves and to others, and that many believe it should now all be over without realising what a long haul it is. As the next slide breaks down that expenditure, and you can see public salaries, social protection is level, public salaries coming down, interest going up, you're servicing your debt, and total expenditure. And if we move on to the 3rd slide, as this chart will show in a minute, currently expenditure, excluding interest on debt, stands at 107% of revenues. Obviously, what is not covered by receipts must be borrowed, so getting aggregate tax receipts up and keeping aggregate costs in check is the only way to stop the interest bill growing. Expenditure, including interest payments, is still 120%, and this is with falling interest rates, people. After 5 years of correction and collective sacrifice, our government, on our behalf, spends €6 for every 5 it collects. This is where the public discourse sometimes starts to become a bit disconnected from the harsh reality. What we have taken to calling an austerity policy in a somewhat lazy shorthand in Ireland is not a policy choice unless we believe that spending €7 for every 4 we collect would somehow be a policy alternative to the 6 for 5. In this regard, I listened to two experts on our national airwaves recently, and I'm in danger of getting up on my high horse a little bit on this one. Here we were, an RTE interviewer in the middle of the day, and a politician who shall both remain nameless to protect the innocent. The interviewer asked the politician if the next budget was, and I quote, an opportunity to deliver a tax break instead of paying down debt. As if this was the choice. As these figures show, the choice is between tax breaks and growing the debt by a few billion, or bigger tax breaks and growing it by a few billion more. Borrowing more under our current debt levels may silence those lobbyists looking for a short-term result for their particular constituency. It may even deliver very short-term relief for some hard-pressed, lucky few. It will undoubtedly make for an easier political term for the elected government, but it is not, I believe, collectively in our medium or long-term interests, and when it cannot be delivered on sustainably, it will need to be reviewed. The hard slog is not over. We are simply not there yet. Too much more borrowing and the public purse will become unstable, given current debt levels, and crucially, it will constrict future policy choices, both on taxes and on spending, as the debt must be serviced. In the event of an extraneous shock from an uncontrollable source, just as we've talked about, it would render the situation precarious. The interest bill as a percentage of total expenditure in 2009 was 4%. Today, it is over 10%. Increasing the interest bill, which must be paid if lenders will continue to lend, reduces policy expenditure choice. That is just simple mathematics. Arguments for capital investment do exist, and there are certainly many policy choices to be made around types of taxation and levels of expenditure, particularly those policies that encourage job creation and employment and thus promote growth. But in my view, there is little or no case to be made for rowing back or easing off on the path to right the public finances. Given the hardship experienced already by so many, this is not an easy or palatable message. In fact, it's really a bit grim. But the hard reality is that we are in this for the long haul, absent a game-changing deal on our debt, which seems increasingly unlikely, and given our current growth rates, both here and worldwide, it will be quite some years before public finances can be described as robust, and it will require continued discipline and vigilance. Until then, there is little leeway for increasing aggregate expenditure or reducing aggregate tax take. What we have instead is the important public policy choices around extracting the best value for money we can from our public sector spend, tweaking individual taxes to ease the pinch on those worst affected, finding policies that support viable jobs and encouraging those that have it to spend. And isn't it here that the public debate should be focused now? I believe this first real and primary threat to our recovery is that we lose discipline and indulge ourselves in a couple of rounds of vote-buying budgets or similar Dutch auctions in the run-up to the next election. Rather than depressingly familiar calls for tax breaks and an end to so-called austerity, if it is the case that every democracy gets the government it deserves, and whilst appreciating the delicate balance required, I wonder, might we have modestly more courageous politicians were we to collectively better develop the stomach for hearing the tough stuff and to insist on real reform in how annual budgets are developed and spent, as well as clarity and transparency in public debate on these issues. The second major threat I would like to touch on goes to the heart of reform in the financial services system and touches on a topic on which I've been reasonably vocal over my years in the central bank, namely house prices and the banks. And here I agree with a lot of what Shay had to say. So there is now a year-on-year increase in parts of Dublin of 22%. This is patently not a sustainable rate of growth. However, some house price recovery does help a lot of people. It helps the government and the economy generally. Lots of people feel a bit better about their largest asset, feel a little more confident and in turn are more likely to spend and contribute to tax coffers. And remember, there is over 100 billion in Irish banks in savings. Secondly, it helps all those unfortunate folk who are mired in negative equity and suggests a pathway, albeit over time, out of that to recovery. It may even encourage others to sell and thus free up supply. Finally, and importantly, it also helps the banks, and not insignificantly. In all stress test modelling, a key assumption of the capital models is house prices. Any uplift in house prices directly increases the collateral value on loans, as much of the arrears book is now so late in arrears that the bank must provision down to collateral. This effectively establishes a floor value for that loan. Increasing house or commercial property prices increase the value of the loan held, thus directly limiting the likelihood that more capital will be needed in the banks before the stress tests later in the autumn, in advance of the ECB taking over the regulation of the banks under banking union. In addition, a new generation of buyers is now entering the market for the first time, and they believe the worst is over. And so, as an added benefit to the banks, there is opportunity for them to lend again and thus make profits. More construction activity means people are back at work and tax revenues rise. So potentially no further capital needed and some talk of rising tides. Everyone is happy. Indeed, what's not to be happy about? Have we not been here before? And importantly, the hopelessly indebted are still not dealt with. Whilst there has been some improvement in major urban areas, the rest of the country has yet to feel the benefit. In addition, the system starts to feed off itself and the seeds of financial instability are sown again. These conditions have the potential to develop into another asset bubble. It is interesting to note that at this time, with stress tests on the horizon and asset values just starting to experience some uplift, with the talk of a recovery and many of the current house purchases driven by cash buyers and investors, that it would take a brave regulator indeed to impose lending limits, income multiples or other so-called counter-cyclical buffers in an attempt to dampen rising house prices, if they believed it necessary. Can you imagine the ructions? So when the time comes to intervene, and sooner or later it surely will, it is for sure that the regulator will need to be politically and socially tone-deaf. There is certainly unfinished business in the arrears of both SME and mortgage loans. The next great threat to our recovery is how we are going to deal with these persistent long-term arrears 6 years on. 1 in 6 mortgages on family homes has some level of arrears on that loan. 1 in 12 has arrears of more than a year. This threat is both a threat to the stability of the system, social cohesion, and more directly and personally to those involved, and living with that over-indebtedness, usually to multiple lenders. The insolvency service, the change in the law after the Dunn judgment, the operational capability in the banks are now in place. The mortgage targets have made a public spectacle of the bank's progress. So where are the deals? How have other debts been dealt with? What happens to the credit union sector or small businesses as these losses crystallise? What is to happen to those ineligible or unable to avail of the insolvency services? How will we deal with the inevitable repossessions and voluntary surrenders? I believe how we deal with all of these issues will be the defining legacy of the banking crisis for society, for the economy and, of course, for the families affected. Right now, it remains unfinished business, and there is much to be done to avoid the risk of further drift. There is much that is right in Ireland in terms of opportunity and much that we can be proud of. We should rightly give ourselves credit for a lot of what has been achieved, including the enormously difficult last few years. But there is also much by way of unfinished business for the over-indebted generation that must be dealt with, and much by way of change required on how we collectively do business in the political sphere on economic policy choices. Moving ahead, though, and before we sow the seeds in the next issue, promise tax cuts that can't be responsibly delivered, ease off on so-called austerity or allow house prices to run unchecked because it makes us feel a bit better. We need to decide we will do it differently this time. Having saved the system, how many of us would much rather we had reformed it? We can decide we will have the debate that will allow the hard choices, that we can and will vote for politicians who have the discipline to stay the course, and that our politicians will discover or continue to display, pick your poison, that discipline. Unfortunately, we have not collectively shown this determination much in our economic history, but having failed so spectacularly this time, it is to fail again not to show it now. And so, I continue to live in a somewhat slightly tarnished hope that we have not wasted our crisis. I am going to end with a little story that on the face of it has nothing to do with the economics or the process of reforming and rebuilding our public finances. But you look like a smart bunch, and I think that when you hear it, you will be able to figure out the parallels. I'm not working at the moment, having just finished up in the CBI, and as I have time and as I have really exhausted all my large store of excuses around getting fitter and improving my health, I'm trying to get out regularly for a run. Now, we're not talking about marathon distances here. It's a 4-kilometre route in Wexford. The roads are very quiet, and I was running up a hill on my way to Tinnabarna Beach. And here I am, plodding along uphill, carrying my years and my general level of fitness and my extra few pounds very heavily, huffing and puffing, and doing that slow shuffle that passes for those that are truly suffering. As I was coming up, there was a woman coming towards me. She was quite smart and well turned out and around my own age. She was strolling slowly in the sun, admiring the view and walking 3 dogs. She said to me, "You're marvellous." And there you have it. For a moment, I was indeed marvellous. That's without getting carried away to Chariots of Fire soundtracks or visions of size zero loveliness. I was out. I was making the effort. I was running. Others were on the couch eating crisps. And although she had only a passing interest, she was more focused on keeping the dogs in check and admiring the scenery. Still, she encouraged me on, and for a moment, I got to enjoy being marvellous and to celebrate my success. So I smiled at her generosity and said, "Och, I'm killed." "No," she said, a little more firmly this time. "You're marvellous. Now keep going."